For some time, Kostya began to feel that he was gradually losing his mind. Of course, working as a pathologist in the morgue, you can really go crazy. But the reason was not at all in the corpses he encountered daily, but in his new assistant Vlad. Some strange things were really happening to him, and Kostya, being an attentive person, had long since lost his peace. Vlad came to the city morgue after a fat cross was put on his career as a surgeon. He himself was a taciturn man of few words, and never talked about his past. The orderlies at the morgue whispered that after all the operations he performed, people died sooner or later. Come on, I think it's just an ordinary coincidence. For sure, more experienced surgeons gave him hopeless patience in order not to cast a shadow on his career. Kostya defended his future colleague. Back then, he still didn't know what he would soon have to face. Vlad was a thin, tall guy in whose eyes it was impossible to read any emotions. He went to work with an invariable backpack on his back and, according to rumors, lived in a small family on the outskirts of the city. Outwardly, Vlad left a not very pleasant impression. A sloping forehead, sunken cheeks and eyes under which there were always black circles from lack of sleep. At first, he was quite normal. He could easily determine the cause of death and make a jewelry incision, which, after suturing, was not visible at the funeral in an open coffin. Otherwise, he was a sullen and uncommunicative guy who, apparently, was not interested in anything but corpses. Vlad could dig into them for a very long time, taking out internal organs several times and examining them in the light of a powerful halogen lamp hanging over his head. Kostya sometimes thought that another moment and he would taste them. But Vlad, of course, did not do this. Kostya tried to get him to talk, but it was all to no avail. Vlad stubbornly did not want to talk about anything except corpses. Putrid, partially decomposed and skeletonized remains aroused in him an unhealthy interest, sometimes turning into delight. Vlad, tell me, can you think of anything else besides your corpses? It's just a job and nothing more, Kostya once asked during another autopsy. Vlad was silent for a while, and then said, you know, I've been interested in the mystery of death since childhood. How it turns out that a person lived, and then, suddenly, once, and for some reason died. Kostya sighed sadly and began to apply a rough seam on the open sternum of an elderly drunk. With this client, everything was clear and no mental reflection was required. He died of cirrhosis, and that said it all. This Vlad, the flask really whistles. The orderlies were telling the truth. He's kind of strange, Kostya thought to himself then. On a normal day, when nothing resonant happened, there was not much work. So, a couple of corpses of people who died of natural causes. For Kostya, such days seemed like a real freebie. Vlad, on the contrary, was gloomy at such moments, and could not sit in one place for a second. He walked from corner to corner and behaved very nervously and sharply. The orderlies laughed, calling Vlad a butcher behind his back. But Kostya, his unhealthy interest in corpses was, to put it mildly, unpleasant. But he still didn't dare to talk about it openly to his partner. Everyone can have their own cockroaches in their head. Well, then, an event happened that turned everything upside down. It all started with the fact that in the early morning 5 corpses were brought to the morgue at once. As it turned out, the poor fellows died as a result of a terrible accident after a drunk driver fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into an oncoming heavy-duty trailer. The bodies were in such a terrible state that even the burned-out orderlies, at the sight of these corpses, grimaced as if from a toothache. In order to somehow bring them into proper shape for the funeral, Kostya and Vlad had to work tirelessly. By the end of the working day, they were literally falling off their feet from fatigue. It remained to put 2 more bodies in order, but Kostya simply could not stay longer. The fact was that he had to go home urgently because his fiancée had a birthday today. Then Vlad suggested, why don't I stay? And what? I live alone. I'm in no hurry. I'll get these poor devils in order overnight. And tomorrow, will you work the day shift instead of me, is it okay? Kostya looked at his partner with disbelief, and then, after all, agreed. Well, then Magrich is enough for me, my friend. Kostya said goodbye, knowing full well that his partner does not tolerate alcohol. Rejoicing that he managed to get off so easily, Konstantin quickly took a shower and hurried to the exit. Deep down, he was glad that he managed to sneak out and not dig with the corpses until late at night. The festive evening for Kostya went just fine, and, at some point, the guy caught himself thinking that he had not had such a spiritual rest for a long time. By midnight, he was already on a fair poker and knew that in the morning he would have a headache. Falling into a heavy alcoholic sleep, Kostya did not even think about Vlad, who at that moment, most likely, was messing with corpses in the morgue. All night long Kostya had terrible dreams in which the dead came to life and pulled their decomposed limbs towards him, in which corpse worms actively hosted. Only in the morning, the nightmares came to naught, but he did not manage to enjoy sleep. The sharp trill of the mobile phone pulled Kostya out of a heavy hangover, which he was trying to survive by closing his eyes. Hello. The pathologist croaked into the phone. Konstantin, what the fuck happened on the night shift? The fact is that Vlad is dead. They did this to him. In general, come soon. You will see everything with your own eyes, the head of the morgue said in a trembling voice. Hearing about this, Kostya felt a terrible tremor all over his body. Vlad is dead, but what could have happened to him? Especially in the building of the city morgue. Even the most notorious scumbag wouldn't stumble into a room full of corpses in the middle of the night, Kostya thought feverishly. After washing his face with icy water from the tap, he drank an aspirin tablet and hurried to work, which was already full of police officers who were desperately trying to reconstruct the crime scene. As it turned out, around midnight, someone expertly cut his throat from ear to ear, and then, ripping open the pathologist's stomach, scattered his bloody entrails all over the dissecting room. According to the paramedics who found the body in the morning, there was even blood on the ceiling. According to the paramedics who found the body in the morning, there was even blood on the ceiling. The police quickly interviewed Kostya, who told them that he and Vlad had agreed to switch shifts. I can't even imagine who could have killed him. Konstantin, suffering from a hangover, was saying. The thoughts in the guy's head swarmed like snakes in the mating season, and, no matter how much he tried, he could not concentrate. As a result, Vlad's body and personal belongings were taken to the Bureau of Forensic Medical Examination, where they were to be examined from and to. But Kostya had to continue working alone. I wonder if Vlad managed to finish the work he started. Wincing from the headache, he thought. The fact was that Vlad worked alone and the orderlies could not say anything definite, since there was only a watchman in the morgue building during the night shift. It was an alcoholic of retirement age who, after all these events, immediately disappeared somewhere. The police immediately put the watchman on the wanted list, but Kostya was 100% sure that the watchman had nothing to do with it. What happened here anyway? Kostya thought, looking around the autopsy room. Although Vlad's remains had already been removed, there were still streaks of blood on the walls in places. Having decided to go all the way from the beginning to the end, Kostya began to study the corpses of 5 people who died in a car accident one by one. Among them were 2 women and 3 men, one of whom was the culprit of the accident, who during his lifetime poured into himself so much alcohol that it would be enough to bring down an elephant. After examining the corpses, Kostya came to the conclusion that Vlad had managed to put only one body in order. Another, belonging to a woman, still lay untouched in the form in which he was caught by death. The most interesting thing was that this corpse had no severe injuries that could cause death. No, of course there were extensive bruises and injuries, but Konstantin knew from experience that with such injuries, the victims usually survived. So, what happened to you, beauty? The pathologist whispered, starting to examine the body. The deceased had red curly hair that fell in a golden cascade over her lifeless pale shoulders. The eyes, as Kostya could hardly determine, were green. Well, you look like a witch. In the days of the Inquisition, you would have been sent to the stake, darling, he said aloud. Deciding that the cause of death of the redhead beauty was damage to internal tissues, Kostya began an autopsy. First of all, he made the usual incision in such cases, which vaguely resembled the Latin letter V. The internal organs of the abdominal department were in perfect order. No tears for you, no bruises. Moreover, they did not seem cold to Kostya at all. Yes, no, not happening. It all seems to me with a hangover, Konstantin thought and continued his inspection. To get to the heart, he used a special saw to cut the chest and ribs. And here's your heart, baby, Kostya muttered and gently touched it with the finger of his right hand, clad in medical gloves. Well, then suddenly, at that very moment, Kostya felt a beating with the pad of his finger. It was simply impossible to confuse these rhythmic contractions with anything else. From surprise, Konstantin pulled his hand back and jumped a meter away from the autopsy table. No. It's all nonsense. She's dead and I know it for sure, Bones thought. He was about to call the paramedics for help when the door of the autopsy room closed by itself. Kostya saw with his own eyes how the lock made 2 turns and froze in the closed position. God, what's going on? The pathologist thought with horror. At the same time, Kostya heard a loud slap behind him, which happens when a large piece of meat comes into contact with the glossy surface of the tile. Konstantin slowly turned around and saw that the girl's corpse was already lying on the floor of the autopsy room. At the same moment, the neck of the deceased crunched loudly, and her head arched at an unnatural angle. Leaving behind a trail of blood, the dead girl crawled in the direction of the bone. The dead man's fingers, ending in a sharp manicure, clenched and unclenched like the claws of a harpy. Come here, dear. You like me, don't you? Is not it so? The deceased croaked and stretched out her crooked hands to Kostya. No, no. Oh, you beast. Well, no, you won't take me so easily, Konstantin shouted and began looking for his favorite scalpel for long incisions. Meanwhile, the revived corpse of the girl crept closer and closer, with every movement, making a sickening, squelching sound. Kostya rushed to the table with the instrument, intending to grab a scalpel, but the crawling creature was quicker and, like a cobra in a throw, grabbed his leg with its teeth. Trying to free himself, the pathologist could not keep his balance and collapsed to the floor. The deceased howled triumphantly and, scattering her tumbled entrails in all directions, reached for Bones' throat. Well, that's it. This is the end, the pathologist flashed in his head. Plunging into the sticky, bloody darkness, he saw out of the corner of his eye how the door of the autopsy room opened and several orderlies appeared on the threshold. Kostya woke up a few hours later. At first, he decided that he was in paradise, but after looking more closely, he realized that there were bright hospital walls around him. Bones' hands and feet, for some reason, were handcuffed to the bed, and there was a gag in his mouth from a bandage rolled up several times. After the guy woke up, the police entered the ward, who were already familiar to him in the case of Vlad's murder. One of them pulled the gag out of Kostya's mouth and, without any transition, asked Cullen, "Well, what will you tell me how it was? Or will you continue to fool around with Vanka?" What are you talking about? What do you allow yourself? Kostya screamed, breaking into a scream. Well, if you don't want the good, then we'll do the bad. In the backpack of your colleague Vlad, we found a video camera on which, as usual, he recorded every autopsy he took part in. We watched the recording and saw that around midnight, you broke into the dissecting room and killed Vlad. From such an unprecedented lie, Kostya turned pale and screamed. I couldn't have been in the morgue last night. At the specified time, I was celebrating my fiancée's birthday. You can easily check it out. The policeman smiled ironically and then said, Yeah, of course. We have already done this and made inquiries. Yes, that's just your fiancée, Elena Petrova, died 5 years ago in a car accident. Yesterday, she could have turned 30 years old. 5 people died in that accident, and only the driver was lucky enough to survive, and that drunk driver was you, Konstantin. After the words of the policeman, Kostya began to fight in hysterics. Then, the guardian of order showed the pathologist a photo of his deceased bride. In her, Kostya easily recognized the same red-haired dead woman who, not so long ago, wanted to tear him apart. The policeman talked for a long time about sluggish schizophrenia and paranoia, which had been slowly taking over Bones' mind for 5 years. But Kostya didn't hear him anymore. In fact, Vlad, who died at the hands of Konstantin, was not at all strange and did not enjoy the sight of corpses. Yesterday no one was killed in an accident, and the revived corpse of a girl was just the fruit of a played-out, sick fantasy of Bones. It was he who, having had too much alcohol on the eve of the anniversary of his fiancée's death, killed Vlad on the night shift and escaped from the morgue, scaring the watchman to death. All this time, he was slowly going crazy, remaining an ordinary person for everyone. Gradually, everyone forgot about the fatal catastrophe, the culprit of which he became because of his irresponsibility and alcoholism. But the spark of madness caused by the death of 5 people has already taken possession of Kostya's brain, developing into a terrible paranoia. Now, for the murder of a colleague with extreme cruelty, Konstantin faces a long sentence. But that's not what the former pathologist is afraid of. More than anything, Kostya is afraid to see his late bride again, who now comes to him more and more often in nightmares.